Good evening and welcome at the Literaturhaus Berlin. We're standing here in the small room, the kleine Saal, amongst an exhibition that we have done together with the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation. And so I'm very pleased and happy that today Florian Stroop is with me. He's curator and head of the residency program at the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation. And so I would like to invite you to tell us a little bit more about tonight's event, but also about this exhibition that you can see here in the background. Florian.
Thank you so much, Sonia. It's a pleasure to be here again for the fourth time. In 2020, we started to do tandem residencies, meaning we invited visual artists and authors together to live and work in the master's houses in Dessau. The residency program means that we invite artists to live and work in the World Heritage Master's Houses in Dessau and put up an exhibit in the Haus Gropius in Dessau. But also, together with you, we have our concluding events in Berlin, and as part of those events, we also put up a small satellite exhibition, and that's what you can see in the background, a work by Hannes Bajohr. But I would just briefly like to mention all of the wonderful artists and poets, authors, novelists that came during the last 2 years to work with us on this wonderful program. So Ingemann and Sujata Bhatt started, a sculptor and a poet, and then followed by the novelist Christoph Magnusson and the photographer Jan Tichy. Then in 2021, we had the pleasure of having the artist and architect Sophia Dohna and the author Mara Genschel here with us. And now for our last and concluding tandem residency, Alexis Lowry, the curator from the Dia Art Foundation, and the author, philosopher, and literary scholar Hannes Bajohr.
So yes, wonderful. Thank you for telling us. So tonight's couple is a wonderful combination, and both of them, there will be a moderation, of course, as well. So Jules Pelta Feldman, she's an art historian and also a curator, and she will speak to Hannes Bajohr and Alexis Lowry, and they will together tell us a little bit more about the residency. The exhibition you can see here at the Literaturhaus, but also at the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation. So please have a look at the exhibitions and enjoy the evening.
Have fun.
Have fun.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sonia and Florian. I'm delighted to be here this evening to moderate the discussion between Alexis and Hannes. And I'd like to begin by asking each of them to speak individually about their projects, and then we'll talk a bit about the legacy of the Bauhaus and life at the Bauhaus, since, of course, much like the original Bauhauslers of a century ago, Hannes and Alexis were both living and working on site in Dessau, and I'd like to explore a little bit about the impact that had on the work that they did there. But first, so that our viewers at home can get a sense of the exhibition in Dessau and have a little bit more of an idea of the site, why don't we start with the trailer?
It's really exciting to think about how this scenario is able to activate the most radical part of Posenenske's work. She called her publics her consumers, so the people who bought the elements or the people who collected them or curated them in some way. And in this workshop that we've devised here, everyone becomes the consumer.
Ich habe mir gedacht, dass ich mich eher mit der unsichtbaren Infrastruktur der meisten Häuser befasse. Also das, was man jetzt nicht unbedingt sieht, was nicht unbedingt mit Architektur oder anderem zu tun hat, und vor allem was die rechtliche Infrastruktur angeht.
People could come in and interact with scale models designed by Diana of Posenenske's Series DW, which are these incredible cardboard elements.
The models themselves allow sort of an agency to come to an individual to configure them.
Dazu bin ich jetzt im Stadtarchiv gewesen und habe mir die Konvolute angeguckt, die aber so von 1926 bis 1935 ungefähr eigentlich die Geschichte der Meisterhäuser, ihrer Miete, ihrer Vermietung, ihres Baus und so weiter erzählen. Das ist eine eher direkter Archivfund und der bringt im Grunde was zur Sprache, was man sonst nicht sieht.
Workshops will be held where people can manipulate these models and create configurations.
The assembly of these pieces or the vision for them becoming something that is a collective act rather than just the artist as sort of the master.
Die Inhaber der Meisterhäuser beschweren sich, dass sie durch den ungehinderten Zugang in ihren Mietsrechten gestört werden. Es soll wiederholt vorgekommen sein, dass das Publikum die Lücke benutzt hat, um sich einen Weg nach der Kreisstraße Ziebig-Groß-Kühnau zu verschaffen. Wie der heutige Augenschein ergab, ist die Einzäunung noch immer nicht veranlasst worden, sodass das Publikum noch immer ungehindert über das Grundstück in das Areal der Meisterhäuser eindringen kann. Der provisorische Abschluss, der mit geringen Mitteln durch Stacheldraht und einige Pfähle herzustellen ist, dürfte später wieder entfernt werden können.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex and Sebastian, for rolling the trailer. So we have kind of a teaser of some of the topics that we'll be discussing this evening. So I'd like to begin by asking you, Alexis, about your work with Charlotte Posenenske, because I know that this is not a new topic or preoccupation of yours. So I'd like to ask, first, what attracted you in the first place to working with this artist, and about the challenges of curating this particular body of work.
Take myself off mute here. So I started thinking about Posenenske's work seriously in terms of work that I would want to engage in a curatorial practice in 2015 when I joined Dia Art Foundation, and we were looking at identifying voices and figures who were not in the collection, but who made significant contributions to the conceptual and material and formal framework of kind of minimalism, minimal art. And Posenenske is this kind of radical figure whose work looks minimal in some ways, but really does very, very different things within a shared set of constraints around industrial production, repetition, seriality, and so forth. And so these modular sculptures, which are produced in open-ended editions, were sold at cost at the time, basically have very few limitations on how they can be installed beyond for the series D and DW, the cardboard and metal series that we showed at the Bauhaus. You have to have at least two pieces. And that is because Posenenske wanted you to understand that there is a series or a logic to this work that extends beyond the kind of singular object. So I organized a retrospective at Dia with Jessica Morgan, our director, and many, many other colleagues who contributed to kind of really understanding the framework of the work that we then also acquired for the museum. And that retrospective was really took Posenenske's own designs for the sculptures as its point of departure. We looked at particularly the drawings that she made at the time, which often looked like drawings that Salouet made, these kind of systematic unfoldings of all the possibilities for how you could arrange a set number of elements. It turns out, in fact, that Posenenske and Salouet were casual pen pals. They exchanged letters and drawings. So there really was this kind of shared connection. And we did this quite formal, though, for Dia experimental retrospective, and acquired the work and realized that we had, knew that we were going to have the opportunity to then re-show it and kind of rethink it. So in the second phase of our presentation of Posenenske's work, which we organized in the middle of the pandemic, we somehow managed, we have a very, very large facility at Dia, very open and socially distanced friendly. So we were able to bring people from the public who had come to workshop lectures and talks and workshops that we had done during the course of the retrospective. We invited everybody who participated in any of those public events back to DIA to work with Diana Mangazer, who is a brilliant architect who lives near the museum in Beacon, to kind of think about these to make models for how one might install the work. Those models were then turned over to our art handling team, who then installed the work for us. So it was a really kind of crowdsourced installation via the game of telephone. And what I realized, so it kind of opened up the possibility for me that the designs of like truly liberating the work or the installation of the work from the kind of single curatorial author, which I think is what her work has so much potential to do. And Diana and I talked a lot about how to do that, and came up with this idea at Bauhaus to basically allow these models that she then further reconfigured for Bauhaus to constantly be on view and manipulatable by anybody in the public. So you'd really understand the materiality or the physical structure of the work. And then to have those models
sorry to interrupt.
become...
Why don't we pull up image 5?
Yeah. And then have those models become the shape of the actual sculpture. So turning entirely over the design of the installation to the public. And that's, I think, the real radicality of what is possible in her work. And that, I think, actually we need next slide.
Sorry. I have
picture.
Yeah, that was...
You could look at slide maybe 11 or 12. 12? Yeah, so here's somebody punching out the models, and if you go to the next page, there are some of the models on the windowsill, and if you go still further to 2 more slides on, slide 14, the last one, you'll see, back one. There we go. You can see cardboard installations and people at work with the modular version.
Great. So essentially, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Diana came up with a system in which the fundamental forms, because there are a number of forms that are kind of endemic to the series by Posenenske, could be literally punched out of these smaller pieces of paper and manipulated by just about anyone, by curators at DIA, by visitors to the exhibition at the Bauhaus. And then those models would serve to, from what I understand, both serve literally as models for the larger works, but also to give people kind of hands-on sense of the possibilities.
That's exactly right. And what I loved about the models so the models come in they're paper and they're flat packed. And when you open the series DW, which are the cardboard series, they also come flat packed. So there's this kind of amazing way in which the models modeled the artwork as well, in terms of like their functionality and their production. And I also loved how Diana, when she originally came up with this idea a couple of years ago, was pulling on Posenenske's own interest in showing two-dimensional, these kind of schematic drawings of the series W and D, which she would print in gallery, as part of the gallery materials when she showed the work in Art International and kind of a couple of other venues. So she herself was interested in this kind of, I don't want to call it discrepancy, but in the space between the diagrammatic form of the work and its physical manifestation.
Yeah, and I think it's really quite effective, and something that strikes me. You mentioned your interest in reclaiming Posenenske, or sort of finding a place for her in an art history that hasn't necessarily been paying attention. And I wonder if it isn't especially important to you to hold on to this flexibility, or find a way of maintaining it as Posenenske becomes a canonical figure, and these sculptures become sort of increasingly recognizable, to make sure that those images don't get fixed.
I think you just hit the nail on the head about like sort of the crux and the challenge that the estate now has to navigate, especially with the passing of Posenenske's widower, who had done a huge amount. His name was Burkhard Brennan. He did a huge amount to revive her legacy and ensure that the work lives on. But as objects enter, especially museums, right, even objects that are meant to get interacted with, increasing limitations get placed upon those objects to preserve them. But at the same time, that preservation takes them out of their original purpose and functionality. And I think this is a great tension to navigate for the estate and those that represent it, to kind of help ensure that museum practice doesn't stifle the work in some sense as it tries to save it. And our show, using the objects and crowdsourcing them, is part of that, kind of trying to make that point visible.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderfully effective solution, and it also occurs to me as you're speaking that there's possibly a connection there to the opportunity to live in UNESCO World Heritage Site. These houses, these Bauhaus Meisterhäuser, that were, of course, built, as all architecture is, to be lived in and to be used, and that the program that you both participated in allowed exactly this kind of making alive of something that has become history. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, Hannes, I'd like to talk a little bit about your project, and I'd like to begin by asking you to describe the research process that sort of brought you to the text that you did. Which aspects of the story of the Bauhaus were you hoping to uncover with this project?
Right. Maybe it's a good idea to say that there was a topic that connects Alexis's and my stay there. It was the Bauhaus every year has a Jahresthema, a yearly topic, and this one was infrastructure. So the idea to live in the Meisterhäuser, to be on site, the Bauhaus, somehow lend itself to the idea of really engaging with the infrastructure of that area. I mean, if you're in Dessau, you have the main building, and then a little bit, 500 meters away, there's like a plot of land with fir trees, and they're the Meisterhäuser, and we would live in one of those. And it was a bit of a challenge because I usually work with quite differently. I mean, you already saw that in the trailer. It's these little signs. I usually work with larger data sets. I run them through different computational processes. I make literature out of patterns that you find in corpora. And initially, some of the vague idea was to use the textual archive of the Bauhaus as a kind of pattern recognition, and somehow work with the text that is there, which of course only works if this some archival record is digitized, which it wasn't, or only to a certain extent. So then I changed some of the idea a little bit and looked at the very material archive. And I went to the city archive and the state archive of Saxony-Anhalt and looked for documents pertaining to the Meisterhäuser. So to somehow find their hidden infrastructure, that what you don't see when you go and visit it. Which, by the way, is also an aspect we might want to talk about. That being at the Meisterhäuser, you live in a, as you said, UNESCO Heritage Site. So it is actually a big museum. And as I said already in the trailer, I found convolutes from 26 to I think 39 actually. There's a short but vivid history of these houses, from the building after the Dessau moved from Weimar to the Bauhaus moved from Weimar to Dessau in 25, up to the sale of the whole complex, of all the Gropius built Meisterhäuser to the Junkers factory, which was then already owned by the Nazis. And this archival somehow basis included legal documents, rental agreements, sale contracts, invoices, inventory lists, other things, but also the correspondence between the tenants and the city, which was at the point actually the legal owner of the Meisterhäuser. Gropius built it with his architectural company, and then at the behest of the city. So from these elements, from all these interesting archival finds, I made excerpts and put them on the signs that you saw in the trailer, and they're now distributed around the Meisterhäuser area. And the idea was to show that invisible infrastructure behind the somehow very with great effort restored architecture of the 20s of the Bauhaus. The idea was to add somehow a layer of the intangible information that is connected to the very real architecture of the buildings on site. You could also say it was kind of about the social infrastructure of objects in space that is not immediately visible in that space. And I mean, we saw a couple of images. If you like, you could put one up too. And this layer is now added through signage in proximity to the architecture. It's you might say, type of analog augmented reality. There are also posters people can take home inside the Haus Gropius, where the Posenenske works are. And there's also an advertising column that is planned that at the time when I was there wasn't quite realized, but they're working on it. It's the slide 6, I think, and don't know if the numbering is right. And in slide 7, how it is supposed to be. Yeah, this is the rendering I did. This is the some of the posters that you can read in any direction. This is Gropius's garage there. I don't know where it will be put. And the next slide is what is actually in the works now. This is a advertising column, a Litfaßsäule from Basel, I believe, where I incidentally live now. And yeah, I think it was used. I mean, it says 1929 there for a Bauhaus exhibition or something. So if this will be put on the 6 posters that are also now at the Literaturhaus, will be will make a 3-dimensional text that you can read in any direction.
Yeah, thanks. And well, I'd like to come back to the Litfaßsäule a little bit later as well. So in other literary projects that you've done, you've, as you said, used ready-made corpus of texts that are put together by other people for various reasons. And for this project, you were really kind of creating your own corpus. And what emerged out of it was, in a way, a history of these houses told through these quite varied and incidental documents that you uncovered from various sources. So I think it might be interesting to talk about one or two of the sources that you found. Maybe we could go to slide number 2.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they're all quite different, and I think, in a way, so the way I usually work is through using this corpora, through appropriating existing text, but very often I do something with it, I process it. And here I didn't do that. I basically just took the raw documents, and in several instances I actually did change it. We'll come to that. But what you see here is if I'm not mistaken, the reconstructed half of the Kandinsky house, the Haus Kandinsky. And what you see here on the sign, that is kind of just the raw factual information of the production cost, of the labor that went into building the houses. And the idea here is that we usually connect these buildings with a kind of disembodied architectural project. some of the genius of Gropius or some what have you. Bauhaus is a kind of a force of modernism, but the buildings were actually made by people. They were produced. They're entangled in a certain economic situation, and this is what you see here. What actually went into producing it. So something that rarely, I think, comes up, but is very much part of the material history of the building. I could go to maybe just the next one, slide 3, would be in a similar vein. This is a suggestion from an anonymous clerk, from a bureaucrat in the magistrate, and he added this. He somehow made the suggestion how to determine the rent based on the building cost. So he says, with that much in building cost, this many square meters, it would be appropriate to take that much rent. And I find this is something that you very rarely see either in these sort of modernist icons. Something very pedestrian, like how to actually get to the amount of money that the tenants who were the Meister at the Meisterhaus at the Bauhaus would have to pay. So this is the one type of document I found, kind of facts and some cold information, but there are more personal documents as well. Another source were letters, communications between the tenants and the magistrate, who, as I said, owned the Meisterhäuser. Some were amusing because they were related to my experience staying there too. I mean, the text that I read in the trailer was that the Meister complained about the fact that people would walk across the plot and asked for barbed wire fence to put up. And I had similar thoughts being there, because when you are basically living in a museum and there's tourists all around you, and at some point it gets a little annoying. If you go to the first,
which of course is a classic complaint, right? There's a famous letter from Lionel Feininger in which he talks about being on display because the houses were so new that people would just come, and he said he feels like a zoo animal. And it's interesting that today that's a similar experience, no longer because the architecture is so startling, because of course modern houses are no longer something necessarily shocking, but because now it's the site of worldwide importance, and so people come and peer through the windows.
Maybe let me add one more example, which is slide 5, which was interesting. So I found letters, for instance, from the last Bauhaus member Meister, who had to move out in 1939, I believe. Hinek Scheper was also the tenant at the place where I stayed. And he asked the magistrate to release him from the contract because he could no longer afford it. But this one here is I don't know if you can see it in the stream. I came across a letter of a certain Adolf Detmann, of his lawyer, saying that he also wanted to be released from the contract in May 1933 to, quote, police measures. And there was nothing else there. And I found out that Detmann, who lived next to Scheper, was the manager of Junkers, the big airplane factory that would later be bombed, he was a manager, strangely, with communist sympathies. The head of Junkers was a left-leaning, and he had hired Detmann right before he was forced to sell the factory to the Nazis. And Detmann went into hiding and worked at a bookseller in Hamburg. And it's just this little note where he asked his lawyer to get his contract canceled because he was not allowed by the Nazis to return to Dessau. He went away, and he was not allowed to come back. And there's just this little speck of a whole kind of life story that's in the archive. It's kind of intersects somehow an arc that intersects that only touches the Meisterhäuser that you find in that archival trove. He even has a Wikipedia page. So my hope was that people who do not know the name but are maybe as intrigued as I was by that police measure notice, might just Google him and find out more about him. And I think it is an interesting story. He lived, I think he lived until the 70s. He was a bookseller after the war. He also was involved in a case suing against allowing to have Hitler's Mein Kampf re-released after the war and things like that. So just a tiny biographical somehow finding that I found fascinating.
Yeah, and you really managed to find, even in the diversity, not just of the documents themselves, but of the types of documents, from, as you say, these very dry lists of costs or lists of objects to these much more politically charged and even personally, emotionally charged letters. You manage in a way to kind of encompass many of these different phases and flashpoints in the history of the site. Yonkers, of course, is a factory of great importance to Dessau and also to the Bauhaus specifically, known for their airplanes, but they were also making all kinds of modern conveniences, water heaters and things like that. And there was a real kind of synergy between the Bauhaus and Yonkers in creating modern conveniences that could then be part of these modern homes that were being built. And so the fate of the Yonkers factory and the people who work there is indeed, as you say, tied up with that of the Bauhaus. So of course you have all of these different sources, different perspectives, different opinions. But it's significant that the texts are all presented in the same way. So they're lowercase text, of course, in the Bauhaus style, which was a proposal from Moholy-Nagy, who lived in one of the Meisterhäuser, and in the typeface Arial, which is today the official font used by the Bauhaus Foundation. Dessau.
Strangely, yes.
So why did you want to bring these sources together as a single corpus? Why was it important to take them from these different archives, these different places, these different contexts, and give them a stylistic unity?
It was basically just a play on the Bauhaus corporate identity, which is very easy to imitate, especially now since it's a type of Arial, and to make them look like other official signage. So have them look trustworthy. So people can immediately identify them as Bauhaus signs, but they also kind of play with this mimicry a little bit. So you can convey information, but you can also make them create interesting effects when you bend the official CI a little into something more literary. And there's, of course, maybe this is how we could bring Alexis back in. There's also, of course, also an element of seriality in there. So the similar presentation that repeats prepares your attention to the format, but also to the deviation from the format. Even you have to do a little work to draw the connection between the sign and the site it is about.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the theme that was the sort of grounds for both of your projects was infrastructure. And it's an interesting topic, certainly in relation to Posenenske's sculptures, which often look as if they might serve a very practical purpose, but of course they don't. So Alexis, I wonder if you might have something to say about infrastructure as a visual code rather than a matter of practical engineering in Posenenske's work.
I love this question, and I actually think Hannes has already started to talk about it in really compelling ways, in terms of the way he's mining a kind of, in mining the archive, the infrastructure of the archive itself starts to get challenged. But I think Posenenske uses a visual language that's very recognizable as industrial and infrastructural. The duct venting that moves air through buildings is kind of invention that was critical to the development of the modern city. So she uses that visual code to signal what the work does, which is look at a kind of set of networked relationships, right? Because infrastructure is ultimately the thing that connects different parts so that they can work together, right? And I think what she's doing is looking at that visual code to think about how, and to require people to work together in really particular ways, or to be really become increasingly self-aware of how they're working together, right? So there's a kind of coordination that happens at every level of the installation of these works, from the dance between the 2 to 3 people that it requires to literally assemble the pieces, to the relationship between the work, the curator, and the institution. And so I think for her, it's not the infrastructure of the archive that emerges so much as like really challenging the infrastructure of the museum. And I think this also really speaks to your earlier question, this kind of legacy that she has, in that the work it enduringly pushes against the systems of the museums and the market. And in that sense, it's not quite remarkable to me that push can still be felt today, and the work doesn't feel static as a result. Like it hasn't been, the conceptual framework of the work is such that it continues, and I think will continue to challenge the systems that are in place for our kind of experience of artwork, our formal experience of artwork. But yes, I think using this kind of visual code also, to me, the kind of the seriality, the modularity is this kind of gesture towards the modern, right? And in that sense, this kind of relationship to the Bauhaus, I think, is really fascinating too, right? And this kind of the modularity of the home unit, for example, that you see in the Gropius houses, with all of the rooms being these kind of squares that are interconnected by all of these doors that can be opened and closed to completely reconfigure the arrangement of the house. I think that was the biggest revelation to me spatially when I was living there, was kind of, it seems almost absurd when you first enter that there'd be so many doors in a house. But it really allows you to, it's so many doors, but you can, it's also remarkable how significantly opening one and closing another totally changes the experience of the space. Suddenly the atria, little entrance area, becomes part of the living room. And the kitchen becomes this kind of massively far away void by shutting 2 doors. I mean, it's a very simple device, and I think the logic of that device is it's like at the heart of what we call modernism, right? Or a certain kind of modernity, and that is something that she's picking up on. That I think is also part of this kind of visual code that she's signaling with.
But when I first saw those, I had to think of the radiators in the main building of the Bauhaus, because they kind of made a point, or Gropius made a point in putting it up high, almost like a painting, exhibiting some of the functionality in its formal aspect. And some of this was the first thing that came to mind when I saw some of the assembled series there. But I also thought maybe it's also completely anti-Bauhaus, right? Because here the functionality is completely removed. It is simply a semblance of functionality, and it's exhibiting that which the Bauhaus or modernism was interested in without actually delivering it. There's always something subversive about it.
I think yes, completely. I think, though, for me, the subversion also comes from this kind of injection of play. I mean, the Bauhaus also, play is really important, especially for Schlemmer, which is the house that I was staying in, and Posenenske has an interesting connection to Oskar Schlemmer herself. But, for me, there's a kind of level of subversion, too, in the way in which she kind of elevates this idea of play to be kind of fundamental, to be as utilitarian, something that should be as utilitarian as the heating vent or the shelving system, right? That it's a kind of fundamental component of our daily lives for us to be kind of healthy. So I see that kind of operating there. But yeah, I loved that. So Posenenske studied theater as a young woman. Before she became a visual artist, she studied set design with Baumeister, Willy Baumeister, who was very, very good friends with Oskar Schlemmer. So there's this kind of lineage that she has. They collaborated, Baumeister and Schlemmer, and looked particularly at, in Posenenske's work, she looks at form in her especially her earliest series, the A, B, and C, these kind of geometric shapes that are bulbous, convex or concave, these kind of very distilled excisions of the she takes them from cars, so the kind of visual language of automobiles, but they remind me very much of the kind of Schlummer's early masks, kind of thinking about the kind of core forms that create a shape.
Or even how Gropius put there are all these videos that show you how he designed the master's houses, and one is somehow taking very simple, basically just cubes and putting them into each, somehow stacking them, and this is how you get the Haus Gropius, for instance.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating, and it's a great point that you made, Alexis, about the modularity of the master's houses as Gropius designed them, both in terms of this sort of abstract scheme of cubes, and also, as you say, the kind of internal experience of the architecture and the modularity of being able to, within one solid building, create different kinds of spaces. And it's really interesting how you connect that to, of course, to the modularity of Posenenske's work. Although I have to say, I was also thinking kind of about the opposite of what you said a moment ago, Hannes, about this idea of so explicitly exhibiting functionality, because I think, having both lived in Gropius's houses, you could probably also both point to instances in that architecture where the ostentatious show of modernism or modernity, as the case may be, kind of takes precedence over that functionality in a way, where the kind of visual sign of that which is modern and that which is functional is actually more important than the substance behind it.
So for me, that was incredibly palpable the minute I walked in, because I brought my wonderful husband, Alex Benson, and my baby, who was a year and a half at the time. So fully mobile, but deeply unreliable to keep himself safe. And we started going up the stairs, and there's the gorgeous glass curtain wall that runs, along the length of the building, the height of the building, and this, the suspended stairwell with the gap between the stairwell and the wall, so that you can really see the weight being removed from the window, right? This kind of like all of the architectural feats that happen, which signal this kind of modernity and bring light in, and like the baby could fall right through that. And these houses were designed for children. That was the surprising thing. On the top floor of the Schlemmer house, there are 2 bedrooms, which, by the way, had open access to the roof gardens, which had no railings, or very, very minimal railings. So you have these bedrooms, then you could descend these stairs that are like death-defying for small children. So yeah, I think that contradiction between what signals functionality and what is actually functional is very much on view.
I couldn't find any reports of children having big accidents. Although I can see how that would happen. This is also a reason why. I mean, it's great to live there. You learn a lot about the Bauhaus. It is completely different from visiting it as a guest, which I did a couple of years ago. You go through it and think, interesting. But living there, you really there's so many things you notice. Also, that this is really at the beginning, and they didn't really had worked out all the kinks. So the variable space that the doors create, for instance, you also always walk into a door because it's always somewhat in the way, and it was kind of it was more of a vision of practicality than some of the execution of it. Which is also that this is no longer compatible, or the way that Gropius designed it is no longer compatible with modern or contemporary health and safety standards, which is why officially you're not allowed to use the balcony, etc. What I mostly remember about living there, however, is the smell of this one particular, somehow, it's a type of linoleum that the Bauhaus love to use. I forgot what the name was. Yes, triolin.
Triolin, yeah.
Very
And
good.
it has a somewhat pungent smell. And I think, it's staying there for 6 weeks. At some point, it was connected to a positive experience. But I remember this is something you can't, it doesn't really go away. It has been there for 80 years. It's still there, or almost 100.
Yeah, I think for me also the legacy of that architecture it's like civic legacy or municipal legacy. The house feels in some, it's much more beautiful than how I'm about to describe it, but it sort of reminded me of a middle school, right? With the linoleum floors and the primary colors and the metal stairwells. There's a kind, and that in some ways was the point, right? These kind of mass producible building blocks.
Still very
but
expensive.
Very expensive, very high end.
Yeah.
Right. And obviously what you end up having is, the legacy is IKEA, right? At its kind of most extreme. Sorry, Gropius. But yeah, I kept thinking of gymnasiums for some reason. When I was with the triolin floor in particular made me think of that.
Yeah, and of course, what the experience of even living in those houses today cannot do is take us back to a point where we don't know the Bauhaus, where its influences have already permeated not just so many aspects of architecture and design, but other forms of culture. And it's hard to, something that I sometimes found difficult in my experiences there was to distinguish between to sometimes recognize the radicality of certain features that are so normal or have been normal for more than half a century in terms of modern architecture. And then also looking at the things where you can see that Gropius is experimenting and that these are things that maybe all those doors, where, as you both said, you can sort of see where he's going there, but it wasn't maybe necessarily the most practical way of creating different options. And you can see that he's really sort of trying things out. So I would also like to ask, in terms of urban infrastructure, I'd like to go back, Hannes, to the Litfaßsäule, the advertising column. And I know that part of where that idea came from is that when you were living in Dessau, there are a lot of actually empty Litfaßsäulen in Dessau. When you walk around the city, you see these just white advertising columns whose function has kind of somehow dropped away. So I wanted to ask you about this idea and why you thought that the Litfaßsäule would be a good medium for this work specifically. And maybe we can pull up, let's pull up maybe slide number 6, please.
Yeah, there was an early idea. The whole point of a residence says you go and you think of something there. You don't have the idea before you go. But almost the first day, I think I noticed all these advertising columns, the Litfaßsäule, which I think only in German has a name, and they were all over the city, and they're all empty. They're white. So actually, someone went to the trouble to put white posters on it because keeping the old posters visible would be a service to the poster owner who does not want to pay for that. The rent any longer. So there's something on the one hand quite beautiful around these dysfunctional columns, but I also saw that they were kind of a decentralized channel into the city. It would be a way to extend the exhibition from the Meisterhäuser throughout the city just by renting the column. So the initial idea was to let the Bauhaus almost spill into the city and get that iconic classic austerity of the Bauhaus into contact with some of the old parts. The majority actually of GDR modernism that's there. Dessau was bombed heavily because of Junkers during World War II. and I think it was about 80% destroyed. So it was rebuilt after the war, and if you walk around, it is fascinating a city. I think you have first the Stalin style, the wedding cake style that is very ornate and from the 50s. But then some of the functionalism of the GDR took over with some of the prefab buildings, the big slab style buildings, which was an indirect or rather roundabout heir to the Bauhaus, even though the Bauhaus at the time was still seen as Western and capitalist. Despite Hannes Bajohr, for instance, being the director for a time, until I think it was appropriate in the late or in the mid 70s, 76 or something like that. So the one idea was to bring those two somehow histories into contact through this decentralized Litfaßsäule system. We tried to rent them, but the problem was actually they were prohibitively expensive, which is why most of them are empty, which is strange for a region like this. So it's too expensive for local businesses. This lack of funds is really visible throughout the city through these columns. So then we ordered a column which was too small, and now a different one is being built, as I said, from a kind of a historical model. And I don't know where it will be put, but I think probably somewhere on the area.
Can you also briefly say something about the text that you chose for the Litfaßsäule? Because I believe that's one we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, that's right. So I did a couple. This is probably the one that I most edited. It's all the tenants' contracts had a very detailed list of the inventory of the things that were part of the house, of the master's house, or of the Gropius villa. And I really like lists. I think they're a beautiful form because they're very austere. They almost have no subjectivity. They're just somehow there's a democracy of the list. At the same time, they're extremely expressive. It's kind of the immanence of relationless objects that are just strung together. So I saw all those inventory lists for the different houses, and they were passed on to the next tenant and then extended if the previous tenant wouldn't take something. So I connected all these items with conjunctions like and, also, moreover, and so on, and then spread them across 6 posters that you could read basically as an infinite loop. So if you're at the end of one poster, you can just start over at the second one, and so on. And this is also what is on display at the Literaturhaus at the moment. And the idea was to put it on the Litfaßsäule so you can read it in any direction, really. I could read a very brief excerpt in German just to get a feel for it. If you, I think German is fine because I think it somehow loses some of its style in English.
Some of its beauty.
Yes. Ein Lüftungsfenster mit Metallklappe und 3 Rotscheiben, außerdem ein vernickelter Teewandtisch und 4 Glas-Wandkonsolen, dazu 2 große Bücherregale mit Schrank und Sofa einbar und ein transportabler Kachelofen. Überdies eine Nickelvorhangstange an der Decke, ca. 5 Meter lang, und 2 Ascheneimer im Hof, darüber hinaus eine Antenne mit Zuleitung, außerdem ein Blumenkasten und ein Marmor-Doppelwaschtisch mit Armaturen und ein vernickelter Wandglashalter, zudem eine emaillierte Badewanne und eine wasserdichte Armatur, desgleichen eine Kohleschaufel und ein Wandglaskonsole, weiterhin ein emaillierter Vierkantofen und ein Erso-Spültisch mit Abtropfbrett und ein säurefestes Tonbecken mit Hahn und Installation, zudem ein Topfschrank und eine Rasiereinrichtung, überdies ein Kolossusherd, lackiert, etc., etc. What I really like about this is it's this weird specificity to it. There's the brand names that come up, the Colossus Waschtisch, but the objects, the names of the objects themselves, that some of these things actually have names at all, I always find fascinating. Just there's like the Soffittenleuchter always comes, and it's a specific type of bulb that the Bauhaus loved. The Steingut Waschtisch and so on. I don't know. There's something nice in just stringing these names and these words somehow in a loop after one another.
Yet there is absolutely a poetry to the list, and I have to say you read it very beautifully, and it's an interesting maybe I'll also just say briefly for the non-German speakers among us, it's an interesting mix of, as you say, very, very specific types of objects, sometimes with brand names, sometimes more elegant sounding pieces of furniture, sometimes very ordinary, everyday sorts of objects. And I think this kind of accumulation of all this stuff is actually a very important aspect of the story, really almost of the infrastructure that you might not otherwise grasp as a visitor to the Bauhaus Dessau as a museum today, because we often think about works of architecture, and especially modern architecture, as these sort of pure forms, right? As you were saying, you have there are wonderful animations from the foundation where you see exactly how Gropius took these cubes and put them together, and what can sometimes be lost in that kind of rendering or that kind of distance architectural approach is the lives that were lived in these spaces and the things that people had and the kind of everyday reality that was also essential to what the Bauhaus was supposed to be, right? Because it wasn't just these ideas, it was a space to live and to work. So what I'd like to ask both of you in closing, we talked a little bit about how living and working at the Bauhaus changed the work that you were doing there. But I'm also interested to ask about how living and working in the Meisterhäuser may have changed your understanding of the Bauhaus, its history, its meaning, its legacy, and also the contemporary reality of the site.
I think one thing. I mean, we mentioned this before. You live there like a zoo animal. You live in a museum, and for you, the person living there, this has kind of a demusealizing effect. You kind of see what otherwise is simply a very large piece of an exhibit, namely the house itself, as kind of a living organism or as a livable site. And there's certainly something you learn about that. I mean, we talked about the doors and the smell and so on. On the other hand, it is because you live there like a zoo animal, and the tourists come and look through the windows and knock, which happened all the time, every day, which is incredibly annoying after a while. We put signs up and so on. But it somehow heightens this museum aspect. It makes the fact that you live there even more striking and almost somehow counterintuitively brings to mind that all of this is gone. The Bauhaus is history. It has somehow seeped into our lives, but that Bauhaus there is dead and gone. And there's something slightly melancholic about that, I think. I mean, you notice it just being around the house that when did people think that linoleum was such a great idea? This seems like a strange notion of the future. So, but these little things that kind of the past's vision of the future as completely outdated is something what you run up against all the time. And I don't know, there's something like almost why try so hard to keep it alive, which of course isn't what you should say in a museum, but it's something I experienced most strongly there, apart from the other somehow being really there, knowing how it was meant to be used.
I think for me, I should say, first of all, the way in which being in the Bauhaus shaped the project that I wanted to do was arriving there, and the minute you're there and you start thinking about the kind of public infrastructure that is or the kind of mass production that was at the heart of the Bauhaus project in the masters' houses. There's the deep irony that emerges, and I realize that I think what Posenenske's practice is about is de-authoring and kind of trying to distance herself from that kind of concentrated kind of genius idea. And, you know, everything about the master's houses is set up to reinforce that, the kind of great mind, right? The genius artist. So the ateliers are just stunningly beautiful spaces. They're huge, they're airy, they have these curtain walls. They're really cushy studios, right? They're meant to cultivate this kind of creativity. So that was the aspect of Posenenske's work that I immediately, when I got there and couldn't have predicted until I got there, realized I wanted to surface, to kind of push against the architectural, this infrastructure of the Bauhaus itself. Anyway, I think for me, Hannes, you said it really beautifully, this idea of being in this suspended space makes you even more aware of the nostalgia of the project. I guess I kept coming back to how, even within the context of what I've just said about the kind of master's model, incredibly experimental it was, and how deeply felt the influence is. And I think that, to me, obviously I knew that. I have a PhD in art history, I studied the Bauhaus, and it's like I knew how important it was before I got there. But that to me became just mind-boggling to me, that this really small community, ultimately, it's a school and, you know, 4 houses. It's not a huge amount of space. Had that punched so far above its weight, so to speak. And that came home for me when I came home and I got a haircut. And I was chatting with my hairdresser who studied at with Vidal Sassoon. And he was saying, oh, you were at the Bauhaus. You know, that's the principles of the Bauhaus were fundamental to how I learned to cut hair.
That's so cool.
You know, the reach from such a small place really, I'm still kind of trying to grapple. And I can't imagine a condition in which you could have that again today, the kind of global impact coming from such a tiny, condensed place.
Yeah, and it really, I think something that I think you're both getting at is the idea that the Bauhaus is so much more than these spaces, these physical architectures, and this linoleum, and these doors, and these radiators on the wall that you lived in and experienced. And of course, it's also true that the Bauhaus was also all the people who emigrated and traveled and taught and continued sort of different versions of these ideas. And I guess in a way, you now both belong to that cohort. Do you have any other comments or any questions for each other?
I just wanted to say that I enjoyed it very much. It was really had a very lovely time there. It was great
really,
having
really fun.
Yeah, having Alexis as a
And
neighbor.
I think I still probably owe you a bigger thank you for making us German "please do not enter" signs, because we also had the fishbowl moment, and you came and rescued us at a time when we were, how do we stop this? So no, it was really fun. It was, and Florian, also thank you for making it possible and thinking of a pairing that was so generative. So.
Well, thank you both so much for your thoughtful words about these projects. And unless there are any other comments from Florian and Sonia, I think we'll conclude for the evening. Thanks to everybody for joining us. And thanks to all the organizers and all the tech support. And have a good evening.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.